What starts as a simple traffic stop quickly unravels into something far more sinister. Because these two officers didn't pull over just any driver, they pulled over the wrong woman. A black widow, calm as ice, sharper than steel, and with more power than they could ever imagine. They thought they were in control. They thought they could intimidate her. But what they didn't know, she's the mother of the most powerful man in town. And she's about to expose a system that's been broken for far too long. This isn't just about one arrest. It's about legacy, justice, and a reckoning, years in the making. Stick around, because this ending, you won't see it coming. It was just past 10 p.m. in Silver Creek, Oregon. A town where nothing ever seemed to happen, at least not on the surface. The streets were soaked in mist and silence. Street lamps buzzed softly above rows of trimmed hedges and picket fences. Their yellow glow reflected off the wet pavement like quiet warnings. This was the kind of neighborhood where porch lights clicked off by 9, and folks trusted each other to return a borrowed rake. But on this night, something was about to disturb that stillness. A gray Lincoln sedan made its way down Sycamore Lane. Behind the wheel sat Margaret Ellis. A 68-year-old black woman whose very presence radiated dignity. Her posture upright. Her hands steady on the wheel, even as grief swirled just beneath the surface. Margaret had just come from a candlelight vigil honoring her late husband, Robert. He'd passed 1 week ago to the day. 42 years of marriage, 3 grown children, and a lifetime of activism, gone, just like that. Tonight was supposed to help her begin letting go. But loss doesn't obey calendars. And in the soft hush of her car's interior, Margaret could still hear his voice when the silence stretched too long. She wore a long gray wool coat over a navy dress, the same one she'd worn to the funeral. Her pearl earrings gleamed gently with each flicker of the passing street lights. Her hair, white as snow, was swept into a simple bun. Margaret had the grace of a woman who had taught Sunday school, led food drives, and never once lost her temper in public. Not even when people gave her reason to. As she turned down Cottonwood Drive, a pair of headlights emerged in her rearview mirror. Close. A police SUV. Margaret noticed. Of course, she did. You don't live nearly 7 decades as a black woman in America and not know when you're being watched. She told herself it was nothing. Just a patrol car heading the same way. No reason to jump to conclusions. Still, her grip tightened slightly on the steering wheel. She took the next turn. Then another. The SUV stayed with her. By the third turn, it was no longer a coincidence. Her heart rate ticked up. Not fear exactly, but something older. Familiar. She switched on her hazard lights and gently eased the Lincoln to the curb beneath a flickering street lamp. The SUV pulled in behind her. Its red and blue strobes lit up the neighborhood like a crime scene from a TV show. Inside her car, Margaret moved slowly. Carefully. She reached into her purse, retrieved her wallet and registration, and placed them both on the passenger seat where they were clearly visible. Then she folded her hands in her lap. Her breathing steady. Her back straight. She had done nothing wrong. But that had never guaranteed her safety. The patrol SUV's door slammed shut. Heavy boots crunched against damp concrete. A flashlight beam cut through the night, dancing across the trunk of her car, then her back window. Then a voice. Sharp. Clipped. Lacking any human warmth. Driver, roll down your window. Margaret complied. The officer approached quickly. White. Mid-30s. Blonde ponytail. Sharp jaw. Hard stare. Officer Haley Dunn. In Silver Creek. Her reputation preceded her. Young. Ambitious. And known for her zero-tolerance approach to anything that didn't look like it belonged. Her flashlight aimed straight at Margaret's face. License and registration. Margaret pointed to the items already waiting on the seat. They're right there, officer. Haley didn't reach for them right away. She stared at Margaret a beat too long. What brings you to this neighborhood tonight? I live here, Margaret replied, her voice calm but steady. 2 blocks over. Just heading home from the vigil. Haley narrowed her eyes. A vigil? For my husband, Margaret said. He passed last week. There was a pause. A flicker of hesitation behind the flashlight. Then these Georgia plates. When did you move here? 3 months ago, Margaret said. To be near my son. Another pause. Then came the shift. I'm going to need you to step out of the vehicle. Margaret blinked. Is there a reason for that? Haley's voice sharpened. Ma'am. Step out of the car. Now. And just like that, the night changed. From quiet to confrontation. From grief to danger. And just down the street, behind a porch railing, a retired firefighter named Jim Hartley looked up from his evening tea. He saw the lights. The posture. The tone. And he knew. He picked up his phone, opened the camera, and hit record. Because sometimes, history doesn't knock. It kicks the door open. Officer Haley Dunn stood tall. But her stance was anything but calm. Her hand hovered near her holster. The other still gripping the flashlight that beamed directly into Margaret Ellis's eyes. There was no, good evening. No, how can I help you? Just pure suspicion. Wrapped in a badge and a uniform. Margaret slowly unbuckled her seatbelt. Careful not to move too quickly. At her age, sudden movement wasn't just uncomfortable, it could be dangerous. Especially with an officer like this staring her down. As she opened the door and stepped out, the cool air wrapped around her like a second warning. Hands where I can see them, Haley barked. Her voice louder than it needed to be. The fog around them carried the sound. Made it sharper, more menacing. Margaret complied. Lifting her arms slightly, as if to say, look at me. I'm no threat. I'm a grandmother. A widow. A woman who's been to more town hall meetings than she can count. But Haley wasn't interested in who Margaret was. She was looking for a reason. Any reason. Haley circled the car slowly. Her eyes scanning every inch like a predator searching for weakness. Where were you headed again? I told you, Margaret said, her voice composed. Home. 2 blocks over. Haley stopped. Staring hard. And why didn't you pull over sooner? Margaret's jaw clenched. I wasn't aware I needed to. You followed me. I stopped as soon as your lights went on. You were swerving, Haley said coldly. Casually rewriting reality. I was not. It's my word against yours, the officer said flatly. And just like that, Margaret understood exactly what this was. It wasn't about a traffic stop. It wasn't even about her car. This was about control. Power. And Haley Dunn was determined to show it. Haley moved closer. Too close. The flashlight now aimed squarely at Margaret's chest. Do you have anything in the car I should know about? Drugs? Alcohol? Weapons? Margaret raised an eyebrow. No, officer. Haley reached for her radio. Pressed the button. Dispatch, I'm on Sycamore and Cottonwood with a gray Lincoln. Female driver. Out-of-state plates. Claims she lives nearby. Requesting backup. Margaret's head tilted ever so slightly. Backup? For what? Is there a problem, officer? She asked. Her tone polite, but edged with disbelief. Haley turned back. Her expression hardened. We'll see. Keep your hands visible. Margaret stood silently beside her car under the flickering light. Her breath clouded in the cold air, but her eyes remained sharp. She was tired. But not weak. And she was not about to be intimidated into silence. Inside the house across the street, retired firefighter Jim Hartley leaned against his window frame, holding his phone like a lifeline. He had a bad feeling, not just because of what he saw, but because of what he'd seen before. Decades on the force had taught him when something was off. And tonight, everything about this felt off. Minutes passed. Then, another squad car rolled onto the street. Officer Ray Collins stepped out. He was older, in his 50s, with a gray mustache and a beer belly under his bulletproof vest. He didn't ask questions. He just nodded at Haley, walked over and said, "What do we got?" Haley didn't take her eyes off Margaret. Suspicious behavior. Out-of-state plates. She got cagey when I asked her to step out. Margaret said nothing, because she knew exactly how this would be framed. Officer Collins turned to her. "Ma'am, do you have any objection to us searching your vehicle?" "I do," she said without hesitation. "I haven't done anything wrong, and you have no cause." Haley smirked. "We can get a warrant." Margaret looked her dead in the eyes. "Then do." Haley walked over and leaned in close. "You know, people like you always think you're better than the rules." "People like me?" Margaret repeated slowly. "You mean people who know their rights?" Haley's nostrils flared. "I'm going to need you to place your hands on the hood of the vehicle." "For what?" Margaret asked. "You're being detained for suspicion of obstruction." Jim Hartley cursed under his breath. "Here we go," he muttered, hitting record again as Haley grabbed Margaret's arm and turned her toward the car. Margaret didn't resist. But her body stiffened as the cold metal pressed against her palms. "I'm not under arrest," she said firmly. "Not yet," Haley muttered. The cuffs clicked shut with a sharp finality that echoed through the empty street. Margaret winced, not from the pain, but from the familiarity. From the weariness of knowing that even now, in this town, in this century, dignity meant nothing when someone didn't want to see it. But she didn't cry. Didn't yell. Didn't beg. Because she knew what her silence meant. She knew who she was. And she knew, even if they didn't yet, that this moment would not end the way Officer Haley Dunn thought it would. She had buried a husband. Raised a mayor. Fought for change when others were too afraid to speak. This would not break her. No. This was only the beginning. Margaret Ellis stood there, handcuffed beside her own car, as Officer Haley Dunn turned back to the second cruiser with a smirk. The red and blue lights still flashed in the foggy night, bouncing off the windows of the sleeping homes around them. Somewhere behind a curtain, someone was probably watching. But no one came outside. The second officer, Ray Collins, scratched his chin and looked at Margaret. He wasn't sure what to make of her. She didn't look dangerous. Hell, she looked like someone who brought homemade banana bread to city council meetings. But Haley was already in motion. And in this department, questioning her meant trouble. Haley had friends in high places. People who saw her as tough in all the ways that mattered. Collins looked down at his boots and said nothing. "Let's take her in," Haley said. "I'll drive." "What's the charge?" he asked, more out of habit than challenge. "Obstruction. Possible false identification. We'll sort it out at the station." He didn't argue. Just gave a nod and turned away, as if washing his hands of it. Haley opened the back door of her cruiser and motioned for Margaret to get in. "Watch your head." Margaret didn't speak. She just sat down slowly, with as much dignity as the cuffs and the cold metal seat would allow. As the door shut, the sound was final. Like the slamming of a cell door on something much older than the night. Something generational. Back inside his house, Jim Hartley put his phone down for a second. His hands were shaking. The video he'd taken, it wasn't long. But it was damning. It showed Margaret, calm and compliant, being handled like a criminal. And it showed Haley, forceful and impatient. Jim had lived in Silver Creek his whole life. He'd seen the neighborhood change. Seen it grow. But this? This wasn't growth. This was a crack in the surface. He grabbed his coat and stepped outside, phone in hand. He wasn't done. At the station, the mood was business as usual. Officers joked. At the front desk, a radio played low country music in the background. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. When Haley walked Margaret in, heads turned. Not because she was a danger, but because she didn't belong there. Margaret walked with slow, steady steps, refusing to let the shame touch her. Her shoulders were still square. Her gaze forward. "Who's the perp?" one young officer asked, looking up from a vending machine. Haley smirked. "Out-of-state driver. Smart mouth. Possible false ID. We'll book her and hold her until we confirm everything." The young officer raised an eyebrow. "She looks like she teaches third grade." Haley's eyes narrowed. "And I look like I ask for your opinion?" Silence followed. Collins peeled off to the locker room, avoiding eye contact. He didn't like the way this felt. But he wasn't going to say anything. Not yet. Margaret was led to a holding room. It was clean. Clinical. Cold. They sat her down at a bench with a metal table. She looked at her reflection in the one-way mirror and took a breath. She had marched in Selma. Had spoken at her husband's funeral just a week ago. And now here she was, treated like a criminal in a town where she paid taxes, bought groceries, and waved politely to neighbors on her morning walks. Haley sat across from her and folded her arms. "Let's try this again." "Name?" "Margaret Ellis," she replied evenly. "Address?" 1432 West Pine. 2 blocks from where you stopped me." Haley wrote nothing down. She just stared. "You got a local driver's license?" "I applied for one. Oregon DMV's backed up. My Georgia license is valid." Haley leaned back in her chair. "You know, most people would be a little more cooperative." Margaret didn't flinch. "I've cooperated since the moment you pulled me over." "But cooperation doesn't mean submission, officer." Haley's jaw tightened. "Why move here?" she asked suddenly. "To be near my son." "What's he do?" Margaret paused just a beat. "City business." That answer wasn't a lie. But it also wasn't the truth Haley was looking for. Back in the holding room, Margaret shifted slightly on the cold bench. Her wrist still bore faint red marks from the handcuffs, but she ignored the sting. She'd lived through worse than this. Worse than humiliation. Worse than arrogance wrapped in a badge. But something about tonight was different. Maybe it was the timing. Maybe it was the bitter irony of being treated like a threat on the same week she buried the man who'd spent his life defending people from exactly this kind of abuse. She glanced toward the mirror again, imagining who might be on the other side. A rookie officer. A watch sergeant. Maybe no one. Maybe it was just her reflection. Dignified. But tired. Not broken. Never that. In another corner of the station, Officer Miguel Torres leaned against the wall as the video ended. He had expected something routine. Maybe even overblown. But what he saw was crystal clear. The woman hadn't resisted. She hadn't been rude. She hadn't even raised her voice. He turned to Jim Hartley. "Do you mind if I copy this file?" "Hell, I was hoping you would," Jim said. "That woman didn't deserve any of it." Torres nodded, slipping the phone into a transfer dock. As the file uploaded, he felt the weight of it settle in his gut. This wasn't just an incident. This was a mess. A fire lit by ego, and fueled by silence. And the department had been here before. Moments later, Torres found himself in front of Sergeant Daniels' office. Daniels was old school. Gray-haired. No nonsense. Always chewing gum like it was holding his jaw together. "I need you to see this," Torres said, placing the phone on the desk. Daniels watched. And to his credit, he didn't speak until the video finished. Then he leaned back in his chair and let out a long, low sigh. "Done again?" he asked. Torres nodded. "And this one's bad." Daniels looked at the door. Then at the phone. Then back at Torres. "You realize if this gets out before we're ready, before command reviews it, we're going to have a full-blown PR disaster." "With respect, Sarge," Torres said, "we already do." Meanwhile, Haley returned to the holding room. Her expression was even more rigid now, as if trying to assert control through sheer posture. But Margaret wasn't impressed. "We'll be confirming your identity shortly," Haley said, offering nothing more. "I told you the truth," Margaret replied, her tone even. Haley didn't respond. She just stepped out again. Margaret sat alone in silence. Then, the phone rang, but not hers. Not the station line, either. This was a private number. One that rang directly in the office of Chief Raymond Holstead. The man answered, groggy. "Holstead." The voice on the other end was calm, controlled, but unmistakably powerful. "This is Mayor Julian Ellis. My mother has been detained at your station. I want an immediate explanation." Holstead sat up straighter, his hand tightening around the receiver. What name did you say?" "Margaret Ellis," Julian repeated. "I expect her released. Now." Holstead's pulse quickened. He knew that name. Knew that voice. And within seconds, so would everyone else at the station. It wasn't just a traffic stop anymore. It was about to become front-page news. The clock on the wall of the Silver Creek Police Department ticked with a slow, steady rhythm. But inside Chief Raymond Holstead's office, everything felt like it was moving too fast. He barely hung up the phone, and already his stomach was in knots. Mayor Julian Ellis. That name wasn't just political. It carried weight. Respect. Fear. Influence. And now, fury. Holstead stared down at the receiver in his hand like it had burned him. Then he stood, fast and stiff, and marched out into the hallway. "Where's Officer Dunn?" he barked to the nearest desk sergeant. The sergeant blinked. "She's in the back. Holding room 3. Holstead didn't wait for permission. His shoes pounded against the tile as he made his way to the back of the station. As he walked past the bullpen, conversation stopped. Officers glanced up from their desks. Everyone could feel the storm coming. In the holding area, Margaret still sat calmly at the table. Her hands rested in her lap. Her posture, despite the humiliating surroundings, was still regal. The door opened, and Holstead stepped in. She didn't stand. She didn't need to. He paused. Staring at her for just a second too long. Then cleared his throat. "Mrs. Ellis, I'm Chief Holstead. I'm going to resolve this situation immediately." Margaret tilted her head. "That would be appreciated." Holstead turned to the officer standing guard. "Get those cuffs off her. Now." The young man moved quickly, fumbling for his keys. "Has she been read her rights?" Holstead asked. "No, sir." "Good, because she shouldn't have been here in the first place." Margaret didn't smile. She simply nodded. As the cuffs came off, she slowly rubbed her wrists, but said nothing. Meanwhile, out front, Officer Miguel Torres stood beside Sergeant Daniels, showing him the video again. Torres's expression was tight. Restrained. Like he was holding back everything he wanted to say. Daniels shifted uncomfortably. "We need to log this. Formally." Torres looked him in the eye. And we need to tell the chief. Now. Daniels nodded, exhaling. You're right. At that moment, Holstead reappeared in the hallway, with Margaret walking beside him. Every officer within sight straightened up, some out of surprise, some out of guilt. Holstead turned to Torres. You walk her to the front. Make sure she's comfortable while we prepare her release paperwork. Torres nodded. Yes, sir. Margaret met his eyes. It was the first kind expression she'd seen all night. He walked with her slowly down the hall, away from the noise. In the front lobby, Jim Hartley was still pacing. He looked up as the doors opened, and saw her. Upright. Composed. Free. Ma'am, he said, stepping forward. I saw the whole thing. I recorded it. You were treated horribly. Margaret looked at him for a moment and offered a small nod. Thank you, Mr. Hartley. Jim Hartley. Thank you, Mr. Hartley. Your voice might have made a difference tonight. Torres looked between them and said nothing. But something in his chest lifted. Back in the rear office, Holstead closed the door behind him and turned toward Sergeant Daniels. Tell me everything. Daniels handed over the phone. You'll want to watch this. Holstead watched in silence. The glow of the screen lit his face, first confused, then tight with dread. When it ended, he didn't say anything for a long moment. Then, he placed the phone face down on the desk. She didn't resist. She didn't raise her voice. No, sir, Daniels said. She was completely compliant. And Haley still cuffed her. Yes, sir. Holstead's jaw clenched. Where is Officer Dunn now? Locker room, I think. Bring her to my office. Now. In the locker room, Haley was halfway through changing out of her uniform when the call came through. She frowned at the text. Chief wants you in his office. Now. She rolled her eyes, muttered something under her breath, and threw her jacket back on. When she walked in, Holstead didn't waste time. Sit. Haley crossed her arms. What's this about? You detained Margaret Ellis. Yes, sir. She was non-compliant. Evasive. You arrested the mother of the mayor of Silver Creek. Haley's arms dropped. Holstead's voice was low now. Dangerous. Did you even ask for ID? Did you verify anything before you cuffed a grieving woman outside her own home? Haley opened her mouth. She had out-of-state plates. She refused a vehicle search. That was enough cause. No. No, it wasn't. Holstead slammed his palm on the desk, and the sound echoed through the room. You embarrassed this department. You racially profiled a black woman, 2 blocks from her house. And worst of all, you did it on camera. Haley blinked. Camera? Someone filmed the whole thing. It's already being copied and passed around by our own officers. And guess what? It's probably already online. Haley said nothing. Holstead leaned forward. You're suspended. Effective immediately. Turn in your badge and your weapon. You're kidding me. I'm not. Haley's face turned red. Because of some political pressure. Because you broke protocol. And because you put us in the middle of a scandal that could cost this town everything. Reluctantly, she unfastened her belt. She placed the gun down slowly. Then removed her badge. The sound it made as it hit the desk was sharp. Cold. Julian Ellis strode into the lobby like a storm front. His coat still on. His tie loosened, but not sloppy. His eyes scanned the room instantly. When he saw her, his expression broke, just slightly. From righteous fury into something more personal. More raw. Mom, he breathed. Margaret stood slowly. Julian. He was at her side in 2 long steps, wrapping his arms around her like the world might try to take her again if he let go. And for the first time since the handcuffs clicked, her eyes closed. Just for a second. Just long enough to take in the safety of her son's arms. "I'm okay," she whispered. "I promise." Julian didn't believe her. Not entirely. But he nodded, his jaw set. "Not one more second here. Let's go." Torres stood as they passed, offering a silent nod to the mayor. Julian paused just long enough to meet his eyes, a subtle, shared acknowledgement. "Thank you." And then they were gone. The heavy glass doors swinging open into the cool night. Back inside, Holstead remained in his office, staring down at the badge on his desk. Haley Dunn was gone. But the mess she'd created was just beginning. He knew the mayor would speak. The community would rise up. Journalists would call. Protesters might come. And every policy, every report, every unsanctioned stop in the last 2 years would be dragged into daylight. He exhaled slowly. Rubbed his temples. And reached for the Internal Affairs hotline. It was going to be a long night. And tomorrow, longer. The next morning, Silver Creek was no longer quiet. By sunrise, the video had already hit local news. By mid-morning, it was national. Footage of Margaret Ellis, calm, composed, restrained, standing outside her car while Officer Haley Dunn barked orders and slapped cuffs on her wrists, played on every screen. News anchors called it disturbing. Civil rights attorneys called it predictable. But on social media, it had another name, Margaret Gate. Thousands of comments flooded in. Hashtag Justice for Margaret began trending on every platform. People weren't just angry. They were outraged, not just at what they saw in the video, but at what it meant. That even now, in a town like Silver Creek, a well-dressed widow, the mother of a sitting mayor, could be treated like a threat. Mayor Julian Ellis stood behind a podium just after noon, flanked by his city attorney and 2 senior aides. His mother sat in the front row, calm, but visibly worn from the night before. He didn't waste time. "Last night, my mother, Margaret Ellis, was wrongfully detained and humiliated by one of our own police officers. She was racially profiled, mishandled, and stripped of her dignity in a moment that should never have happened. Not in this town. Not in this century." Flashes from cameras filled the room. Julian continued. "I want to make this perfectly clear, this isn't just about my family. It's about every black mother who's ever been treated like a suspect in her own neighborhood. It's about accountability, and it starts today." His voice was steady, but his jaw was tight. He wasn't just angry. He was hurt. Across town, Officer Haley Dunn sat in her apartment. Blinds drawn. Her badge and weapon sat in a box on the kitchen counter. Her phone buzzed non-stop. Calls from reporters. Texts from colleagues. A voicemail from her union rep. The footage looped on every channel. Each time she watched it, she told herself the same thing: I followed procedure. I didn't do anything wrong. But the pit in her stomach said otherwise. She clicked off the TV and walked into the bathroom. Looked at herself in the mirror. And for the first time in years, she wasn't sure she liked what she saw. At the station, the atmosphere was electric. Half the staff whispered about the video. The other half watched it over and over, debating whether Haley had crossed the line, or just finally gotten caught. Officer Miguel Torres sat at his desk, quietly compiling everything he'd seen, heard, and witnessed the night before. He wasn't interested in debate. He was interested in truth. And the truth was damning. Chief Holstead had already received a formal letter from Internal Affairs. They were sending 2 investigators down by the end of the day. And that meant one thing. Everything was now under review. Every stop. Every citation. Every complaint. And at the center of it all, Haley Dunn. But there was more. Torres had begun digging into past reports, looking at traffic stops Haley had written up over the last year. And what he found wasn't just troubling. It was a pattern. Unnecessary escalations. Charges that didn't stick. Complaints from mostly Black and Latino residents, many of them dismissed or redacted. Now, with the spotlight glaring, they wouldn't be ignored. And that was before he even checked the name that came up 3 separate times in different reports. Maria Lopez. A single mother with 2 kids. No criminal record. Stopped 3 times in 6 months. All by Officer Dunn. Torres picked up the phone and made a call. Ms. Lopez, my name is Officer Miguel Torres. I'd like to talk to you about an incident you had last fall. Meanwhile, Margaret Ellis sat on her porch sipping tea. The sun was warm, but the air still carried the chill of what had happened. Reporters were camped down the block, respectful, but relentless. She'd received dozens of calls. Old friends. Civil rights organizations. Former students. But the only call that stuck with her came from a woman she didn't know, Maria Lopez. She'd simply said, "Thank you for not staying silent." Margaret had nodded slowly, holding the phone close to her chest for a long moment after the call ended. Because she knew what Maria meant. Because she, too, once had stayed silent. Had taught her children to lower their heads, say yes, sir, and keep their hands in sight. But now, she was done whispering. Now, they all were. By mid-afternoon, City Hall phone lines were overwhelmed. Staffers answered calls in rapid-fire rhythm. Some callers demanded Officer Dunn's arrest. Others wanted the entire department defunded. A few callers, older voices laced with tears, just asked, "How is she? Is Margaret okay?" Outside the police station, protesters began gathering. Not the usual angry crowd with slogans and banners, but neighbors. Teachers. Retirees. People who'd known Margaret Ellis for decades. They lit candles. They held up printed stills from the video. And they stood in silence, for 9 minutes. The time she spent handcuffed and humiliated. A young boy from the local high school handed out flyers that read, "Who polices the police?" At the same time, a live stream popped up on YouTube. The thumbnail read, "Silver, the truth they don't want you to see." It featured not only the footage Jim Hartley recorded, but interviews with residents. Black, Latino, and white, all with their own stories about being stopped, questioned, or threatened by Officer Dunn. One clip showed Maria Lopez outside her modest apartment. She looked straight into the camera. "She pulled me over with my kids in the car," Maria said. "Accused me of driving a stolen vehicle. I cried the whole way home. But nobody believed me, until now." The video hit 50,000 views in under an hour. Back at her apartment, Haley sat frozen. Watching it unfold on her screen. Every new testimonial made her denial crack a little deeper. She told herself it was politics. That people were piling on. That she'd been doing her job. But deep down, she knew better. She hadn't seen Margaret Ellis that night. Not really. She'd seen a profile. A threat. A category. And now the world was seeing her, not as a protector, but as the problem. Elsewhere in town, Pastor Daniel Monroe of Silver Creek's oldest church delivered an impromptu sermon on the courthouse steps. "We often hear, 'This is not who we are,'" he said, his voice ringing through the crowd. "But the truth is, this is who we've allowed ourselves to become. And until we face that truth, we cannot change it." The crowd murmured in agreement. Inside his office, Mayor Julian Ellis sat at his desk, fielding texts from senators, governors, even someone from the White House's Civil Rights Task Force. His mother's name had become a symbol. But to him, she was still just Mom. The woman who packed his lunch. Who marched with his father. Who taught him to tie a tie and stand up straight when facing disrespect? He looked down at his statement, unfinished on the page. He scratched out the word incident. This wasn't an incident. It was a reckoning. He picked up the pen again, and kept writing. Across town, Margaret stood in her living room, watching the footage for the first time. Not the clip Jim Hartley had sent, but the one someone else had taken, from a different angle. Someone down the block. The video caught her voice as she asked calmly, "Is there a reason, officer?" And Haley's face, tight with control. Ready for confrontation. Margaret's hands trembled slightly. She paused the screen. The frame froze on her eyes. Still calm. Still defiant. She didn't recognize that woman at first. But slowly, she began to. And this time, she didn't look away. She stood taller. And she pressed play. 2 days after the video of Margaret Ellis's arrest went viral, Silver Creek was no longer just a town. It had become a symbol. National news trucks lined the courthouse square. Anchors broadcast live under umbrellas, as rain fell in soft sheets. Protesters, now in the hundreds, stood beneath ponchos and makeshift tents. They weren't just locals anymore. Activists had come from Portland, Seattle, even Chicago. At the center of it all, Margaret Ellis sat quietly in a town hall meeting room, waiting for the hearing to begin. It was the first emergency oversight committee hearing in Silver Creek's recent history. A panel of 5 city officials, 2 state observers, and 1 federal representative had been called to review Officer Haley Dunn's conduct, and the police department's pattern of internal negligence. Margaret hadn't planned to speak. But after seeing the crowds, after hearing her neighbors chant her name outside City Hall, she knew silence was no longer an option. When her name was called, she stood. There was no microphone adjustment. No pre-written speech. Just her. "I was raised to believe," she began, "that if you carry yourself with dignity, speak with kindness, and follow the law, you'll be safe." She paused. "That night, I learned that wasn't true. Not for me. Not for women who look like me. Not even 2 blocks from home." The room was silent. Officer Dunn didn't see a woman. She saw a problem. She saw a threat. And what's worse, she acted like she had every right to treat me that way. Because the system taught her she could. Flashes from the press cameras didn't faze her. "I'm not asking for pity," she said. "I'm asking for accountability. And if you think this ends with me, then you're not listening." The applause was quiet at first. Then louder. Then a full standing ovation. Outside, Julian Ellis stood with community leaders, watching the live stream from his phone. His mother had never run for office. Never wanted the spotlight. But there she was, commanding it with more strength than any politician he'd ever met. Inside the police department, the mood had shifted from tense to unstable. Internal affairs had arrived. Files were being pulled. Officers were being interviewed behind closed doors. Whispers filled every hallway. A few officers cleaned out their desks preemptively. Others avoided eye contact with Torres, who now walked with the quiet authority of a man who had seen enough, and refused to ignore it. He'd spoken with 3 residents so far. Each with a nearly identical story. A stop that escalated without cause. A citation that didn't hold. A threat of arrest when they asked too many questions. Each one named the same officer, Haley Dunn. But Torres didn't stop at the surface. He filed formal recommendations to audit body cam footage. Review every traffic stop logged under Dunn's badge number. And open the sealed complaints that had been mysteriously buried over the past year. And with each page he reviewed, a pattern grew clearer. The next hearing would focus on systemic failure. And Margaret Ellis would not be the only voice in the room. Later that afternoon, Mayor Julian Ellis returned to his office, flanked by 2 aides and a civil rights attorney dispatched from the state. They found him already reviewing new reports, ones that hadn't made it into the department's public record. It was worse than he thought. 10 sealed complaints. 7 involving minorities. 5 dismissed without investigation. All involving Officer Dunn. What did she say in her defense? The attorney asked. Julian didn't look up. That she was following her instincts. He set the file down. Instincts don't erase policy. They don't override decency. Meanwhile, Torres sat in an interview room with an older black man named Earl Watkins. Earl had lived in Silver Creek for 40 years. Never arrested. Never caused a stir. But 3 months ago, he was pulled over on his way home from fishing. She said I didn't signal, Earl explained. I did. She just didn't like the look of me in that truck. Torres asked gently, did she threaten you? Earl nodded. Said she could have the truck impounded. Said I was lucky she was in a good mood. Torres wrote every word. In another office, Internal Affairs investigator Dana Reese reviewed a log of body cam footage from the last 18 months. Hours of video. Most of it routine. But Dunn stood out. In one clip, she told a young Latino driver. You don't get to ask questions. You do what I say, or I find something that puts you in cuffs. Reese turned to her colleague. We're not dealing with a one-time lapse in judgment. This is a pattern. A system that protected her. Enabled her. And probably, more like her. As day turned to evening, Margaret returned home to find dozens of letters on her porch. Some were handwritten. Others typed. All from strangers. One read. I watched what happened to you, and I saw my mother in your eyes. Thank you for standing tall. Another simply said. You reminded us what grace looks like. She brought them inside and sat at her kitchen table, reading each one as the light faded. And then came a knock. It was Maria Lopez. She stood awkwardly for a second, holding a small box. I brought tamales, she said. I just wanted to say thank you. Margaret smiled and opened the door wider. Come in. 2 women. 2 generations. 2 survivors. Sitting in a quiet kitchen in a town that was finally being forced to listen. Across the street, Jim Hartley recorded it all from his porch. Not for views. Not for headlines. But to remember. Because this was history now. And Silver Creek would never be the same. Later that night, Margaret sat on her porch alone. A soft blanket over her lap, and the quiet hum of crickets in the background. Her tea had long gone cold, but she hadn't moved. She was thinking about what came next. Tomorrow, she would speak again. Not just for herself. But for Maria. For Earl. For every person who had ever felt small under flashing lights. And this time, she wouldn't wait to be called. She would raise her hand. And they would listen. The second hearing began with tension so thick, even the seasoned reporters shifted uncomfortably in their seats. This time, the crowd had doubled. The room was packed wall to wall, and the overflow had spilled into a courtyard, where a massive screen broadcast the proceedings live. Folding chairs. Coffee thermoses. Umbrellas. Children sat on their parents' laps. Everyone was watching. Margaret Ellis was seated up front again. But this time, she wasn't alone. To her left sat Maria Lopez, hands clasped tightly in her lap. To her right, Earl Watkins, wearing a faded navy blazer and the same stubborn dignity he'd carried through 4 decades of quiet endurance. The hearing opened with testimony from Officer Miguel Torres. When he stepped up to the microphone, the room hushed. I joined this department to protect and serve, he began. But what I saw these past 2 weeks, that's not protection. And it's not service. He detailed the sealed complaints. The missing body cam footage. The citations that went nowhere. The system failed, he said, and it failed in silence. When he finished, there was no applause, just a long, heavy stillness that said more than any cheer could. Then came the residents. Maria Lopez stepped forward. Her voice trembled at first. She pulled me over in front of my children, Maria said. Told me to get out of the car. Yelled at me when I asked why. She paused. My daughter still asks me why the police don't like us. Then, Earl Watkins told his story. His voice didn't tremble. It rang like a bell. I did what I was told, and I still got threatened. So what are the rest of us supposed to do? The final witness was unexpected. It was Jim Hartley. He walked slowly to the microphone. His phone in his hand. Ball cap tucked in the back pocket of his jeans. I've lived in this town for 61 years, he said. I've been a firefighter. I've pulled folks out of burning houses. I've coached Little League. And I've never seen anything that rattled me like that night. He held up the phone. I recorded it because I knew if I didn't, no one would believe her. And I don't care what anyone says. That's not how we treat people here. Not anymore. The silence after his words was thick with understanding. A moment later, the committee chair leaned into the mic. We've heard the stories. We've reviewed the footage. Now it's time to take action. And with that, the hearing recessed for deliberation. Outside the hearing room, the town felt like it was holding its breath. More than just a crowd had gathered. Civil rights lawyers from across the state stood shoulder to shoulder with veterans, youth activists, local business owners, even a few off-duty officers unsure whether to show support or shame. Local news aired interviews live from the lawn. One elderly woman said softly, "We've seen injustice before. But this time, it's not going away." Inside, Margaret leaned over to Maria and gently squeezed her hand. No words were exchanged. None were needed. In a nearby hallway, Chief Holstead watched the stream alone, arms folded tightly. He hadn't spoken publicly since suspending Dunn. He knew his silence was costing him. But he also knew, speak too soon, and it might cost the department more. He wasn't sure which way the wind was blowing anymore. He only knew, it was blowing hard. Back in the hearing room, the doors swung open. The committee had returned. The chair, a tall black woman from the state attorney general's office, adjusted her microphone. Based on the testimonies, the documentation presented by Officer Torres, and the volume of civilian complaints previously unacknowledged by this department, this oversight committee is recommending the following actions. She paused. You could have heard a pin drop. 1. Officer Haley Dunn is to be formally terminated and referred for criminal investigation regarding civil rights violations. A murmur rippled through the crowd. 2. An independent audit of the Silver Creek Police Department's internal affairs processes will be launched immediately, with access to all sealed disciplinary files going back 10 years. And 3. A civilian review board, made up of local residents, appointed by the mayor's office and approved by the city council, will now oversee all complaints moving forward. This time, the crowd didn't murmur. They roared. Outside, the cheers spilled into the streets. Bells rang from the old church tower downtown. Children waved homemade signs. Cars honked in solidarity. And for the first time in a very long time, Silver Creek felt like it was changing. Julian Ellis, standing near the back of the room, bowed his head for a moment. He thought of his father. Of the marches. Of the speeches. Then he looked at his mother. Margaret sat still. Not triumphant. Not angry. Just present. A quiet figure who had moved a mountain by refusing to shrink. And she wasn't finished yet. Because justice, real justice, wasn't just about consequences. It was about repair. It was about rebuilding what had been broken. And now, finally, that work could begin. That evening, as the sun dipped below the hills of Silver Creek, Margaret walked alone through the community park. People stopped her along the path, young and old, white and black. Some offered quiet thanks. Others simply nodded, eyes full of something deeper than admiration. Recognition. Respect. She reached the small garden at the center of the park, where a bronze plaque read, "For those who fought without glory." It had been there since the 70s, funded by her husband's first civil rights case victory. She hadn't visited it in years. Tonight, she did. She sat on the bench beside it and looked up at the night sky. No cameras. No noise. Just stars. And silence. And in that silence, she finally let the weight fall off her shoulders. The shame. The fear. The years of walking carefully, gone. She thought of what the committee had said about civilian review boards. About investigations. It was good. But it wasn't enough. Not yet. Margaret Ellis had never planned to become a symbol. But now that she was, she intended to use it. And what she did next, she would do for every voice that was still afraid to speak. The fight wasn't over. But it had finally, truly, begun. 2 weeks later, Silver Creek was still making headlines. But the story had shifted. No longer just about a traffic stop gone wrong. It was now about reform, resilience, and the power of a woman who refused to be broken. Margaret Ellis had become more than a name. She was a face. A voice. A movement. Community meetings were being held twice a week. New leaders emerged. Young organizers printed flyers with bold phrases like, "Protect, not profile." "Ellis Effect." "Justice looks like this." City Council had begun drafting new policies. Use of force reporting. Body cam footage requirements. Mandatory de-escalation training. People who had never spoken out before now stood on street corners handing out petitions. Sat at folding tables registering voters. Knocked on doors with clipboards. It was as if the town had woken up all at once. Inside the mayor's office, Julian Ellis met daily with attorneys, activists, and civil rights organizations. He was tired, more tired than he had ever been. But he was also focused. For the first time in his career, change didn't feel like a campaign promise. It felt like something real. And his mother. His mother was now the reason people showed up early to those meetings. She didn't need a title. Didn't want one. But when she spoke, the room listened. One evening, standing before a crowd of hundreds in the city library auditorium, she spoke not as a victim, but as a teacher. "Dignity is not a gift," she said. "It is not handed down by badge or office or circumstance. It is yours. Born with you. And no one has the right to take it away." She looked over the crowd. "They tried to take mine," she said softly. "But I never let go of it. Even when they put cold metal on my wrists." A young girl in the front row whispered to her mother, "She's like a superhero." And in a way, she was. But Margaret didn't want to be a hero. She just wanted the next generation not to have to be. Meanwhile, a grand jury had convened to consider criminal charges against Officer Haley Dunn. The DA had moved quickly, citing overwhelming video evidence and a clear pattern of misconduct. Haley had vanished from public view. Her attorney issued brief statements about stress, departmental pressure, and a mischaracterization of events. But the town wasn't buying it. Not anymore. A week before the jury's decision, Margaret received a visitor. It was Torres. He stood at her door, hat in hand, not in uniform. "May I come in?" he asked. She smiled gently. "Of course." They sat in the same kitchen where Maria Lopez had brought tamales. Now, Torres brought something else. A file. Internal Affairs found something in her personnel records, he said quietly. It wasn't just you. It wasn't just the traffic stops. He opened the folder. There were complaints going back years. Even before she transferred here. They were buried. Moved around. Margaret looked down at the pages. I thought she was just one officer, she said slowly. She is, Torres said. But she's also the result of something deeper. A system that taught her she wouldn't be questioned. That silence was safer than speaking up. Margaret nodded. I know that system. She looked at Torres. So do you. He didn't respond. He didn't have to. When he left, she stood at the window watching him walk back to his car. He had changed, too. Everyone had. The next day, the grand jury delivered its decision. 2 felony charges. Civil rights violation under color of law. And false imprisonment. 3 misdemeanor charges. Negligent conduct. Official misconduct. And filing a false report. Haley Dunn was arrested quietly, through the back of her attorney's office. No press. No cameras. But the story still broke within minutes. And across town, Margaret Ellis stood once again beneath the same street lamp where it had all begun. She looked at the pavement. At the place where she had stood, hands raised, dignity intact. It was just a street. Just a corner. But now, it was sacred ground. She placed a small bouquet of flowers on the curb. Lilies. Her husband's favorite. And she whispered. We're still marching, Robert. Still marching. That same night, the City Council passed the Ellis Act, a resolution that required full transparency in officer conduct reports, public access to disciplinary records, and automatic independent review for any incident involving use of force or racial profiling allegations. It passed unanimously. The crowd at City Hall broke into applause. But Margaret, she just smiled. She had lived long enough to know, laws were not the end. They were the beginning. Weeks passed. The protests quieted. The cameras left. But the movement stayed. Silver Creek had changed. Not perfectly. Not completely. But irreversibly. New leadership emerged in the police department. New training programs launched in schools. And every year, on the anniversary of the arrest, the town held a vigil under the street lamp. Not a protest. A celebration. Of resilience. Of courage. Of a woman who reminded them what dignity looks like when it stands its ground. Margaret Ellis never sought fame. She never shouted. But her voice carried. Because it came from truth. And truth, when spoken with grace, echoes forever. A year had passed. Spring returned to Silver Creek like a promise. Trees bloomed early. The air carried warmth that hadn't been felt since before that night. But the memory of what happened hadn't faded. It had matured. Evolved. Rooted itself in the foundation of a town still learning how to grow. Margaret Ellis stood once again at the corner of Sycamore and Cottonwood. But this time, not alone. Beside her stood students from the local high school. Teachers. Preachers. Journalists. Mothers with strollers. And in the front row, her son, Mayor Julian Ellis. The street had changed. The stop sign was now painted with a mural. Bright, bold colors forming an image of Margaret in profile. Beneath it read the words. We see you now. Today was not just an anniversary. It was dedication day. The city had renamed the street corner in Margaret's honor. From that day forward, it would be known as Ellis Circle. The mayor stepped to the podium. His voice steady, his words measured. 1 year ago, this corner was a place of silence. Of shame. Of injustice. He paused. Today, it becomes a place of remembrance, of community, and of truth. He turned toward his mother. She didn't raise her voice that night. But she raised all of ours in the days that followed. Applause rippled through the crowd like wind through leaves. Then came Margaret. She didn't approach the microphone with pomp. She walked slowly, steadily. Dressed in a long navy coat. Pearl earrings. The same ones she wore the night she was arrested. Her voice, as always, was calm. I remember standing here, confused. Angry. Scared. She looked out over the crowd. But not defeated. Cheers rose. This street has changed. This town has changed. But let us not forget. Change is not something we commemorate once a year. It is something we must protect. Nurture. And defend, every day. Her eyes locked onto a group of students holding signs. Be the voice. We are Margaret. I did not ask to become a symbol. But if I must be one, let it be for perseverance. Let it be for the dignity we carry even when the world tries to strip it away. Silence. Then, as if on cue, the crowd rose to its feet. Margaret stepped down from the podium and placed her hand against the mural. Her fingers brushed the painted lines of her own face. And for the first time in public, she wept. Tears not of pain, but of release. Across town, the Silver Creek Police Department had undergone sweeping reform. A new police chief had been appointed, Chief Naomi Grant. Black. Female. Former civil rights attorney. She wasted no time. She removed the old guard. Instituted de-escalation training, trauma-informed community interaction, and open-access complaint dashboards. She also promoted Officer Miguel Torres. He now led the department's Community Trust Division. His job, ensure no voice went unheard. Under his leadership, complaints dropped by 70%. Community trust soared. But Torres didn't rest. He remembered Margaret's words. And he carried them like scripture. At local schools, he spoke to students. Power is not in the badge, he told them. It's in how you use it. To protect. To uplift. To listen. And for the first time in Silver Creek's history, children clapped for a cop. At City Hall, the Ellis Act became a model across the state. Other towns adopted their own versions. Citizen oversight boards became the norm, not the exception. Julian Ellis was invited to speak at state conferences. Interviewed on national broadcasts. Profiled in magazines. But at home, he was still just Julian. The man who brought his mother tea every Sunday. Who asked for her opinion on speeches. On appointments. On policies. And Margaret gave it, honestly. One afternoon, as they sat on the back porch overlooking her garden, Julian asked, "Do you ever regret how it all happened?" Margaret looked up from her tea. "No," she said. "I regret that it had to happen. But I don't regret what came of it." She paused. Some things grow better after the storm. He smiled. And he knew she was right. That summer, the town hosted its first community reconciliation fair. Food trucks lined the courthouse square. Musicians played jazz. Kids painted murals. There were booths for voter registration. Mental health support. And police recruitment focused on diversity. At the center of it all, Margaret sat in a white rocking chair under a cherry blossom tree. People came by. Said thank you. Told her their stories. And she listened. Just like she always had. As the sun began to set, a small boy approached her. He was maybe 8. Tightly coiled hair. Wore a t-shirt that read, "My skin is not a threat." He looked up at her and said, "My mom said you're a queen." Margaret chuckled. "Your mom is very kind." He nodded. "Are you gonna make everything stay fair now?" She looked down, gently brushing a curl from his forehead. "I'm going to try. And one day, you will too." He grinned. Then ran back toward the bounce house. Margaret sat back. She watched the town that once watched her with suspicion. Now celebrate her with joy. It wasn't a fairy tale. There were still problems. Still work to be done. But the foundation was there. Solid. Strong. Honest. And it had been built. By standing still. On one rainy night. Under a flickering street lamp. A place where history shifted. Not with violence. Not with rage. But with grace. And a woman's unwavering refusal. To be small. The years passed, but the story never faded. It became part of the fabric of Silver Creek. Woven into school lessons. City policy. Family conversations at the dinner table. They called it the turning. Not because it was perfect, but because it changed the town's direction. Margaret Ellis never left Silver Creek. Even when national platforms called. Even when networks offered guest spots, book deals, speaking tours. She stayed. Planted. And because she did, so many others did too. Young people who once dreamed of leaving for bigger cities. Now dreamed of building something here. They ran for office. Opened businesses. Started nonprofits. Became teachers, coaches, advocates. They named libraries, programs, and youth scholarships after her. The Ellis Fellowship for Justice. Margaret's Garden Early Learning Center. The Grace Initiative. It wasn't just symbolism. It was structure. Real change, built on real lives. In her home, Margaret kept a small wooden box filled with letters. Letters from strangers. From parents, teachers, activists, police officers. Some handwritten. Some typed. All heartfelt. One letter came from the very officer who once led her from the car in handcuffs. Not Haley Dunn. But Officer Ray Collins. He had resigned months after the incident. Quietly. No fanfare. But his letter was simple. And it read. You showed me what integrity looks like. I should have spoken. I'm sorry I didn't. Thank you for teaching me, even in silence. She never responded. But she kept the letter. Not for closure. For memory. Because remembering was part of the work. One cool autumn morning, Margaret sat on a bench outside Ellis Circle. She wore gloves. A soft scarf around her shoulders. Beside her, a local reporter sat down with a small notebook. Do you mind if I ask a few questions? The young woman asked. Margaret smiled. Go ahead. What do you want people to remember most? About that night? Margaret looked out at the mural. At the new stoplight. At the community bulletin board now filled with flyers, book readings, free meals, health checkups, music nights. I want them to remember that I wasn't the one who changed things, she said slowly. They did. The reporter blinked. But you. I stood my ground. But they moved the world. She smiled softly. And sometimes, that's the power of just staying still. The reporter looked down at her notes, struck silent. Margaret stood. You can quote that, she said gently, and walked on. In a quiet cemetery just outside town, near the sycamore trees, lies a simple gravestone. Robert James Ellis. 1949 to 2023. He walked with courage. He stood for peace. Margaret visited often. She'd sit, sometimes for hours, telling him everything. About the meetings. The students. The latest poem she'd read in the newspaper. Sometimes she cried. More often, she laughed. "I hope you're watching," she'd whisper. "I hope you see what came of us." In the fall of her 74th year, the state awarded her the Medal of Civic Integrity. She accepted it, not in heels or pearls, but in the same navy coat. The same calm posture. The same powerful presence. In her speech, she said, "I am not brave because I was handcuffed. I am brave because I chose not to vanish afterward." She paused. "And I believe this. We can fix what's broken. But we must first admit it's broken." The room stood as she left the stage. No music played. No fanfare followed. Just the quiet certainty that something real had happened in their presence. Back in Silver Creek, a young girl named Alina walked home from school. She was 10. Her backpack heavy with books. She walked alone, past Ellis Circle, past the community garden, down the same street where history had once hung in the balance. A police cruiser pulled up beside her. The window rolled down. It was Officer Torres. "Hey there," he called. "Need a lift?" Alina shook her head. "My mom says I'm good walking. But thank you, sir." He smiled. "Smart mom." She turned. "Are you friends with Miss Margaret?" Torres nodded. "Very good friends." Alina grinned. "She came to our class last week. Told us stories. Said our voice was a candle. That if we all light ours, it's never dark." Torres smiled wider. "That sounds like her." Alina walked on, skipping. Torres watched her go. Then turned his car around. Back at Margaret's home, the porch light flicked on. She sat in her chair. Tea in hand. Blanket tucked over her lap. The world had changed. And yet, still needed changing. But she no longer carried it alone. That night, the stars above Silver Creek burned just a little brighter. Not because the sky had changed. But because someone had finally lit the way.